Hello everyone, my name is Parnali Dharia. I'm a woman international master and today we are going to learn about pattern recognition. Guys, can you just say yes so that I know that I'm audible to you? Guys, someone can you just say yes if I'm audible to you? Shall I begin, guys? Can someone just say yes so that I know that I'm audible? Okay, so today we are going to learn about pattern recognition, and it is basically different configuration of pieces. So different patterns that you need to know to win the game. Like, you can be winning, but if you don't know how to mate your opponent, then how will you win, right? So there are certain patterns with different pieces and different combination of pieces. So let's see the examples with knight and rook. So here there is a mate and it's obvious. Rook h8 is a mate, and this mate is called a hook mate. So this kind of forms a hook, right? So that's why it's called a hook mate. And here the knight and the rook work in perfect combination, and in the examples that I'm going to show you, knight and rook work in a perfect combination to deliver a mate. Is anyone here, guys? Shall I just wait? Hold on. Just a moment, guys. Okay, so let's move on. Maybe people will join in later. Am I audible, guys? Can someone message me? Because I'm not sure. Okay, so this position is called the hook mate. So let's move on to the next position. So here, what do you think should black play? It's a forced mate. Again, a combination of knight and rook. Okay, so here black plays rook e3, and again all the squares are covered, as you can see. So this is another pattern with knight and rook. And by patterns I mean different placements of your pieces, so that you can mate your opponent. If you have a rook on third rank, and for example here, if in this position you sense that that this rook and the other rook are preventing the king from moving, this knight is preventing the king from moving on to these squares, and if you give a check, it will be a mate. So that means that you recall the pattern and you played it. Also in chess, it happens. Hello Vijay. Also in chess, it happens that you don't always see all the moves. You see up to 5-6 moves. You don't always have to calculate, right? Some moves you do intuitionally. So in those cases, pattern recognition is very important, because you don't waste too much time. Because chess, in chess you also have a time limit. You have to finish the moves in some given time, otherwise you will lose on time. So that's why patterns are important, and they are not just limited to tactics. They also happen in positional play. When you realize that a square is weak, so you try to capture it. You capture the square, not any piece or pawn. You capture the square so that you can have some positional advantage. So if you realize that there's an outpost for the knight, for instance, if this wasn't possible, like if just hypothetically imagine that this was a positional puzzle and the material was equal, so this knight would have been great on c5. So that is also a sort of pattern. So let's move on to another example with knight and rook. Okay, so here, can you tell me what white should play? Black is queening on the next move here. So can he save himself? Okay, so white realizes that he can't really prevent this from happening, but he can always give a threat, and so he plays knight f6. So as you can see, this is another pattern with knight and rook, and now it's white who's winning, and there is no way to prevent a mate with rook at 7. It's just a forced mate. So you can queen here if you want, but you will be mated. So this is another very important pattern with knight and rook. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, can you find the move for white here? Again, it's a pattern with the knight and rook. Can you suggest a move, guys? You can take your time. Hello Mohit. I think it takes some time to learn the terminology, but it's not that difficult. Once you learn it, it will be more easy for you to understand. Okay, so here white played something else, but what happens to this? Okay, just queen into e3, and there's a double attack. So it's bad to capture, and this capture is not possible. Is there anything else that white can do here? It's going to be a very interactive session today, guys. I need answers from you. Yes, knight f6 is possible. You're right. Knight f6 is possible. And it's a forced mate again, as I said. You can't really prevent this. But for this is possible. And it will be prolonged again. And this. So there is something similar, Umakant. There's something similar and it's winning. It's like a mate in 2. Umakant, knight f6 is possible, but for rook e8, what will you play? There's this rook e8 move, which saves the game. because this is under attack. So I'll tell you the move. The move is knight h6. Okay, so here you're threatening two mates and he can't prevent both of them. Yes, he can prolong them by playing something like this, but it will be a mate soon. So regardless of what you play, this or this is a mate. So for instance, if you play rook e8, then knight f7 is a mate. Another pattern with the knight in rook, because the king cannot move. Am I clear, guys? Aruna, it's not necessary to play 1000+ matches. If you keep playing, you keep getting better. That's true. But you can, you don't have to play like serious matches. You can play practice matches and you can definitely get better at chess. Also, even by solving puzzles, because pattern recognition, obviously it improves after solving puzzles. Yes, Umakant, knight h6 is correct. Let's move on to the next example. So what do you think should white play here? It's white to move, and again it's a pattern with the rook and knight. Okay, so here what do you think are the options for white? If this was the position, how would you deliver a mate? Which is the piece that is necessary to deliver the mate? And for instance, if it's the queen, then which square? Like for instance, if I had the queen here, I would want the queen to be on d7 and it's a mate. So any other piece that you can think of by which it's a forced mate, and on which square? Yeah, Aruna, knight e5 is correct. And the idea is, if he captures, then you just play knight f7. So knight to f7 was necessary to mate the king, because this rook covers everything. So this was another pattern with the knight. Yeah, Sahil, knight should be included. Yes, Umakant, you're right. So this was another pattern with knight and rook. Let's see another example. Okay, so black has just promoted his pawn to a queen, and it looks as if white is going to lose soon because he's a lot of material down. So what should be played right now, and how can he save himself? In the previous example, Aruna, rook into c6 was possible. Just a moment, guys, I'll just go back quickly. So knight e5 takes, and then knight c6, you can just capture here. So it's not a mate. Yeah. So in this example, what do you think should white play to save himself? Try to imagine all possibilities, and you can see the candidate moves by thinking about check and then capture and then threats. So look for checks and then captures and then threats. Yeah, knight f6, and if I play king f8, obviously for king h8 you can deliver a mate with rook into h7 and you'll just win the game. So what happens for king f8? Yes, Aruna, you're right, knight f6. And for king f8, this is a very typical pattern and it is very useful, because I myself have played this and I have survived one very losing game. It was a dead lost position for me and I managed to somehow save myself. So okay, this is a pattern where you capture knight into h7, king goes to g8, and then knight f6 again. So if he goes back, then you give a check again, and if king h8 again, there is a mate. So there will be a perpetual and it will be a draw. Even if the king goes to e8, then you just give this check. So for this pattern to work, the rook has to be on d7. It is this pattern won't be possible if the rook is on c7, because the king will escape. For instance, king f8, here king e8, knight f6 check, and if the rook was on c7, the king could go to d8. So that's the reason this is very important, this rook on d7. Yes, Mohit and Umakant, you're right. Aruna, rook g7 is not possible because you're giving him one spare move to save himself. So this is a perpetual check and draw. This is a very important example. You should know this, and you can save a lot of games by this particular pattern. Let's move on to the next example. Rook g7 in the start. Here it's, I can just capture it. Not possible. Let's move on to the next example. This is a classic one, and it's a meeting motif sort of. So look for checks and then captures. White to play and mate in 3, guys. Again, knight and rook are involved in this pattern. If you remember patterns, you can recall them while playing, and it is very easy for you to play the game because you know where to put the pieces and how you can win after the pieces are on the correct squares. Look at 7 here. You can just capture right now. But you are right, there is something similar. A similar idea is possible. Try to get the knight. Yes, Mohit, you are right. Knight e7. I think Umakant, you also meant knight e7. So you are right. Knight e7 check. And if the king goes here, then Anush, your move. Rook into h7. And if king into h7, then this is a mate, because again the knight guards all these squares and the rook gives the check. Other knight was white to play. Okay, so this is another example, another pattern with knight and rook. Always remember such patterns, guys, because even if you don't have pieces, and even if you are losing, if you don't have enough material, you can always look out for patterns, because if you can find resources in losing positions, you'll keep getting better. Okay, let's move on to the next example. Okay, so this one is again an interesting one, again to do with the knight and rook. Can you suggest a move, guys? Aruna, which position are you talking about? The one we saw with knight f6 check, rook h7? Yeah, it's a draw. I mean, rook d7 and knight f6. It's a draw, yeah. Knight to c7 is hanging because it can be captured with the rook. There's something interesting here. Anush, you're right. Rook c1 is a great move. It is. And but I can play rook c8. So that's the reason it's not correct, because you can't capture here, right? If you do, then there is a mate back rank. It's white to play, guys. Yes, Sahil, queen b6 is correct. Okay, so here you are sacrificing your queen. There's no way you can protect this by playing a6, because queen a7 is still a mate. And then if you capture, then again the rook goes to a1, and then it is a mate. Queen d2. That's an interesting move, Umakant. It is possible, but again I can just go back with my rook here or here. Just queen d2 is a nice move, but queen b6 is more forced, and it's a forced mate in fact. Can someone reply a yes? Tell me if there is a lag. So takes, and rook a1, the mate, forced mate. And in this example we see a smothered mate. So anyone of you knows what a smothered mate is? It's basically when the king is stuck and it is surrounded by its own pieces. Queen to f6. I don't know, it's not forced. You can win in 3 moves. It's a forced mate in 3. That's the reason why the previous example queen b6 was played. Okay, so a smothered mate is basically when your own king is surrounded by your pieces, and that's the reason there are no squares left for the king, and the knight gives a check, and then there is no square left for the king. So that's a smothered mate, and it's a pattern, a very famous pattern in fact. So let me just flip the board so you can easily understand. So here knight f2 is played, king g1, knight h3 is a double check, so there is no piece coming in between to prevent the check. And if king goes to h1, then can you guess the move? No, it's black to play. It's a smothered mate with the knight. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned. Can you guess the move with black here, guys? Okay, so black gives this queen sacrifice again, and now it's forced to capture with the rook, and now knight f2 is a mate, forced mate, because this is called a smothered mate. As you can see, the king cannot move as its own pieces are on the squares, so it's suffocated and it's a smothered mate. You might be wondering why this was not possible to play here. It's a very common mistake that players do, but here the queen doesn't have any support, so king can capture it. That's the reason we give a check. Then the king comes to g1, you give double check, so there is nothing coming in between to prevent this check. And if king goes here, then queen f2 is a mate. If king goes to h1, then queen g1, rook g1, and knight f2. So it's a very good pattern to remember and very typical. Let's move on to the next example. Okay, so now we are going to see a small game in which white wins with smothered mate. E4, e6, knight c3, d5, d into knight f3, d into e4, knight into e4, knight f6, queen e2. Yeah, double check is very powerful attack. very powerful tactic. You're absolutely right, Anush. And it is, well, it is possible to think like Tal, but he was a genius, and you might play one game like him, but it is difficult to play all games like Tal. He was my favorite player, in fact. Okay, and here here black made a mistake. So what should white do here? Can you see? Knight bd7 looks like a normal developing move, right? But actually it's a very bad move. It's a blunder. It is okay, but you should know a few openings and at least a few basics, like developing your pieces on proper squares, and then you can play according to how you want. But you should know a bit of theory, like which piece goes where, and then you can play according to what you like. After all, you have to be original, right? You can't have everything by heart and then play. Aruna, knight f6 is possible, but there's a forced mate, because for this I can just take, and there's no mate. Yeah, yeah, Anush, knight d6 is the move, and as you can see, it's just 6 moves, and black already lost. He got mated because of his own pieces, and that's the power of a knight, because it is very difficult sometimes to see where the knight is moving. It is difficult to predict knight d6 sort of moves. Right now it's very easy because queen e2 and this e7 pawn is pinned, so he cannot capture, so it was slightly easy. But in the real game, when you're calculating, if this was the position for instance, and then here you have to calculate that something like knight d6 is possible, so obviously it's not easy, because you would realize that knight d7 is not something that your opponent would play, but still it's a trap, and if he plays this, then knight d6 is a smothered mate. So a nice pattern with the queen and knight. So now we are moving to the queen and knight. Let's move on to the next example. A second. Okay, another smothered mate. Yeah, knight OP, right? So e4, e5, and f3 and c6, bishop b5, knight f6, and d3, knight e7 was played. This is already a bad move because you're giving up the pawn. Knight into e5, c6, and now here white played knight c4, black captured, and you must be wondering this is a stupid game, but again we just see the example of how black's own pieces are causing a huge problem for him, and knight delivers the mate, a smothered mate in the center. Again, it's not just limited to corners, it can even happen in the center. Let's move on to the next example. Are you following me, guys? Are you with me on this? So we are going to see another example. e4, e5, and f3, and c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. This is all normal opening. Castles, knight f6, rook e1, you just protect the pawn, and he castles. Then you play c3 in order to play d4. So queen e7, d4 takes, and okay, so now I'm going to flip the board, and can you find the move for black here? It's slightly difficult, but it has something to do with the queen and knight. So try to form a pattern in your mind. How can you give a threat to white king? Okay, so here black played queen h4, and now he is targeting 2 points, and this one. So white has to do something about it, and he played knight f3. h3 was also possible, but you can just capture here and take this, or you can even play this and capture this d4 knight because it's hanging again. So that's the reason knight f3 was played here, and queen into f2 was played. Yes, Anush, queen h4 was played. You're right, absolutely right. And now king h1. Can you find the move here for white? How can you get a piece to a square, and then um how can you deliver a smothered mate? Yes, Rishabh, you're absolutely right. Queen g1 was played, and again we see the pattern of um, smothered mate, and knight f2 wins the game. So let's see another example. This bird versus some player. It is very old game. It was played in 1800s. And f4, e into f4, knight f3, g5, knight c3, g4. Back then there was not a lot of theory, so people used to play whatever they felt like. They didn't have any particular idea about the moves. They would just play whatever they wanted to. Knight e5, queen h4 check, g3. Now it suddenly appears that it's probably black who's attacking, but that's not the case. And after f into g3, you capture queen into g4. So if you capture, then it's another game. And he played g2 check because this is a discovered check. As you can see, the check, and he's threatening to queen. Umakant, it's possible. It's difficult to sometimes find patterns in the game, but if you solve more puzzles, it will be very easy for you to find patterns. You just have to solve a lot of puzzles. This is I don't know the name of this opening. It's not really a proper opening because but you can call it something like King's Gambit because f4 was played and e into f4, but other than that, not really. Time pressure. I don't get it. Okay, so here g2 was played and queen into h4. Obviously, why not capture the queen? And then he makes another queen here. So right now, you can see white is a rook down, but white's pieces are active, and so you will see what happens. Queen h5, attacking this pawn here, and bishop e7 was played. And here you could capture with the queen, but king f8, and nothing's happening right now. So he captured with the knight, and knight f6 was played. So can you try to find the pattern here? I think when we think a lot, we lose time. So we usually calculate a lot where it's not necessary. So you can just play intuitionally, and to develop your intuition, you have to see a lot of puzzles and lot of patterns. Until for knight h8, just knight into h5 is possible. So knight h8 doesn't work. Yes, Rishabh. Yes, Anush, you're absolutely right. Knight d6, and if king d8. I think Rishabh already answered. Queen e8, right? And again we have, regardless of how he captures, again we have a smothered mate. So if knight into e8, then knight f7 is a smothered mate again. And even if he captures with the rook, we've already seen, again it's a smothered mate. So a pattern you should remember: Like it's not just that smothered mate happens in corners, it also happens in center. Whenever you find that your opponent's king has a lot of pieces around him, it is surrounded by a lot of pieces, then look for such moves where you can completely block or suffocate the king with his own pieces, and then you can use the knight to deliver the mate like this. So let's move on to the next example. Okay, so we move on to a queen and bishop, a combination of queen and bishop for mating your opponent. Can you find the move here? It's a forced mate in two. Mohit, I think you can take up to 3-4 minutes while playing one move in the beginning. Like, you should know openings. If you know openings, you don't lose time in opening, and later on you can have enough time for middle games and in game. So if you save your time in the opening, you can always have more time. So you should know openings for that. Some theory you should know, or the basics. Yes, Rishabh, you are right. So queen f6, and if king d7 is played, then you have this bishop c6 and it's a mate. And even if king e8 is played, bishop c6 is still a mate, because as you can see, the queen guards all these squares and the bishop guards all the squares and gives a check. That's the reason. Yes, Anush, you're right. Queen f6 and bishop c6. And this mate is also called as the balustra mate. So that's the name it is given, balustra. So this is another pattern you should remember. Let's move on to the next example. Again with the bishop and queen. Try to look for forcing moves, guys. And by forcing moves, I mean check, captures and threats, because for check he has to act quickly. He can't just give you another check. Like, he can, but it's very rarely possible that a discovered check is possible. Can you suggest a move, guys? A lot of possibilities here, but there's just one correct move. Okay, so here queen d8 was played. You're forcing the king to go to g7, and then you again give a check. Yes, Rishabh, you are absolutely right. Anush, bishop d4 is a nice move, but this is more forcing and this leads to a direct win. While your move is also nice, because by this move you want to give this threat, right? If h5 is played, then you can play this and then there's a mate. I think that was your plan. But here rook b8 and it saves the day for black, sort of. That's the reason bishop d4 is not that forcing. It is a good move, but queen d8 is better. And also queen d8 and not queen e8. You will know why. Because as Rishabh answered, king g7, bishop d4, and when king goes to h6, you need the queen on this diagonal, and you need to play queen h4, which is a mate. So had the queen been on e8, this would have been not possible, because the king can escape to h6. That's the reason queen d8 is correct. And then this is also possible, and it's a mate again, because the queen and the bishop work very well. They are coordinated well. Let's move on to next example. Okay, this is a very typical move and typical meeting pattern. Umakant, f2, I think you mean f6 in the previous example. Just let me quickly go back. Queen d8 here, and f6, I think. Then queen into f6, because if the king goes to g8, queen g7 is a mate, and here then queen h4 is a mate. Yeah, okay. So in this example, this is a very typical move, and most players sometimes just play this and the king escapes. So for that, we need to first play bishop a7. So now you don't let the king escape because queen is protecting this square. So king has to move here, and then you play bishop b6. Then king goes to b8, queen a7 check, and now if the king goes here, then you give a checkmate with queen c7. So it's a very typical pattern to remember, and many people blunder by playing queen a7. In rapid and blitz, you can often see people just play queen a7 because it's a check. But bishop a7 and bishop b6, that's a important pattern to remember. Let's move on to the next example. Okay, so this is a very nice example with queen and two bishops. Even though white is material down, he can still win, and it's a forced mate in 2 or 3. White to play, guys. This is a very beautiful example. It shows you the power of bishops, two bishops. Yeah, bishop pair. Bishop is on fire today. So queen b6 is the move. And now you are threatening to play queen into b7. He cannot capture because this is a pin, and there's no way to protect this b7 pawn. And also this is the mating threat. So this is a very beautiful example. It is slightly out of the box because you don't see such moves during the game, because it is difficult to see something like this because you feel your mind is trained in a way where you think that this can be captured, and this is slightly difficult to see, but it is a very nice move. So there's no way to protect this pawn, and regardless, I think you'll just have to prolong the mate by giving a queen sacrifice, because c6 is also not possible because of this pin, and whatever black plays, it's still a mate. Hello Advait. Umakant, bishop b7 can just capture here because there's no queen b3, or queen f3 can be played, but there's nothing forced. That's the reason queen b6 is an amazing move. Okay, so this is one of my favorite games or other examples. Can you find the move? Go right here and go for the mate, not the material. You can obviously get material, but go for the mate here. The first mate in 2. Yes, bishop f6 check. And what happens to king e8? So king e8 and rook d8. So this setup with the rook and the bishop here, and there's no, for example, this pattern with the pawn here blocking the king and the bishop on this diagonal and the rook coming to d8, or the 8th rank, is basically called as the opera mate. It is known as the opera mate. And what happens to king c7? So king c7, you can just play bishop d8, and to black's surprise, it's a mate because he's again blocked by his own pieces. No king c8, no king b7, no king c6 is possible. So here you might be wondering what happens to bishop b6. but the king escapes with e7 as the reason bishop f6 is correct. And we can move on to the next example. Okay, so black here has just moved rook into c2. He just captured the pawn. And what do you think should white play here? Again, a typical pattern with the bishop and rook. So can you imagine how there can be a mate on the black king? If you can imagine, then you can get that position and you can realize the pattern very easily. So just try to imagine, be very imaginative when you're thinking about patterns and tactics. Yes, Anush, rook d8. And if the king moves to h7, we have rook h8. So this is another, yes Advait, you're right. This is another possibility with another pattern with rook and bishop. So if in case you are playing a game and you realize that if the rook was on c8 and he had not played rook into c2, then you can always remember this, that if ever he moves the rook, then you can play rook d8. So you should always have that option of playing rook d8, and you should keep that rook on the open file, that bishop on that b2 diagonal. So you have this mate. So always be on the look for patterns. Let's move on to the next example. Okay, this is easy. And here black on the next move is planning to play b1 or a1 queen. So what should white play here? It's an easy one, but a very typical one. Okay, so here white plays this. It's white to play. Black is planning to play b1. So how can white save himself or win? Rather, it's not even about saving anymore. Bishop h6, b1 queens, and this is a forced mate. Yes, Umakant. Yes, Anush. Bishop h6, easy win. But again, a pattern to remember with the bishop and rook. So whenever you see that this is a pawn complex right now, like this, and always remember it's good to have this bishop in such kind of pawn complex, because there can be such threats. So that's why I showed you this example. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so I'm just showing you this pattern is known as the Blackburn's mate. Yes, Advait, you're right. So this pattern is known as the Blackburn's mate. I'm just showing you the pattern. This is not a puzzle. And with 3 pieces here, you can prevent the black king completely, a white king completely, and you just have to give a check to win the game. So 3 pieces are completely very annoying for white. Even if he had the queen here and lots of pawns, he couldn't save himself. So in queen versus 3 pieces, this is a very important mate to remember. It is possible to play something like this because they are both 9 and 9, like 3 pieces, so 9 points, and queen is also 9 points. So technically it's equal, you shouldn't give up, and in fact 3 pieces are slightly stronger also because you have a lot of flexibility. So let's move on to the next example. Okay, so this is another one. It's called the diagonal corridor mate. Yes, yes, Anush, you're right. Bishop a7 was possible, but rook f2 and another move. Going back, guys, just a second. Bishop a7 and rook f2 was possible. So obviously right now it's a different position. I was just showing you the theme with bishop h2. Bishop a7 is possible here in this position because you're winning the rook. Yeah. Okay. So here what should white play? he needs to do something about this bishop, but how does he activate this bishop, or how does he suffocate the black king? By giving any sacrifice, or um, by making sure that a piece is brought to a square where the king cannot escape. I think my hint confused you, so I'll just tell you the move. Rook g8 was played, so you're freeing the bishop and you're opening the diagonal, and now bishop into g8, and now you play bishop e5 check. So this is a corridor check, and if queen g7, then you just play bishop into g7 and it's a mate, post mate. Rook g7 was possible, but he can takes, and if he takes, these two pawns are very strong and black will be quick to promote them and he'll probably win. Umakant, you're right. Rook g8, opening the diagonal for the bishop and making sure the bishop blocks the king here, and this is a mate. So another pattern you should remember with the bishop and rook, even if the queen wasn't on b7, yeah, they are passed pawns, yeah. So even if there was no queen here, then this was possible even without the bishop. All you need is this king and pawn, and then bishop and rook. So this is a pattern to remember. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this is my favorite. Into g7. If king f8, then obviously rook goes to f7. But what happens if the king goes to h8? Let me tell you, this is a very typical idea, and two rooks on 7th rank are very strong. They are considered very strong because even if you are losing, you can save the game by perpetual checks, and if you are you can even win the game. And even if you like, if you can be queen down, you can be getting mated on the next move, but you can still have perpetual checks and draw the game. It's similar to the example I showed you with the knight and rook, where you keep giving checks and he cannot escape the king. Black king cannot just escape the checks. Yes, Anush, rook at 7. And what next? Okay, so here you play this rook to g7 and you make him move to f8. If you don't have a pawn here, then you can draw the game since his pawns are stronger. So in case you don't have a pawn, then you can keep giving checks and draw the game. But since you have a pawn here, you can just play f6, and now there is a threat of rook h8 which he cannot prevent because you've protected the rook. So for instance, even if you don't have a pawn on f5 and you have another piece that can protect this g7 rook, for example knight f5 or knight h5 or bishop on this diagonal, something that protects the g7, then you should do it, because now once you protect the g7 rook, rook h8 is possible. So f6 was played in order to protect the rook, and then this is a threat. Okay, so this is a different pattern where mate is not involved, but it is a pattern where you're winning some material, and it is black to play. Am I audible, guys? Can you please tell me?